One of the first times neuroscientists started to investigate the function of the brain was in the classic case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was an American railroad worker in the mid-1800s. He was involved in an accident that ended up blowing, using dynamite, an iron rod straight into his head. This resulted in this very large iron rod extending from the base of his left eye up to and out of his skull. It destroyed a significant portion of the frontal lobe of his brain on the left-hand side and required a lengthy recovery time. He survived, however, to the astonishment and amazement of many people at the time. During his recovery and after, however, coworkers and friends reported some changes in him. They reported that he seemed to be more impatient, cursed and swore a lot more, and became indifferent to others when he didn't used to be. Other people at the time countered and conflicted these reports. Scientists now know, however, that the frontal lobe is involved in decision-making, especially in recognizing consequences of potential actions and acting on decisions in light of those potential consequences. This damage to his frontal lobe could have made Phineas Gage a little more impatient, a little more rowdy, and a little more indifferent to the feelings of others. And so this loss of function would account for some of the reports of his behavioral change. Newer studies, thankfully, don't rely on damaged tissue in the brain in order to measure and understand neural activity. These newer studies instead use techniques involved in neuroimaging. The first one of these is the fMRI. The fMRI stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. The way that it works is it monitors blood flow changes in response to brain activity. Oxygenated blood has a different response to a magnet than non-oxygenated blood. And fMRIs are based on the assumption that where oxygen is needed in the brain is also where brain activity is taking place. And so by measuring where oxygenated blood is being transported, we can get a better understanding of what parts of the brain are being used at different times. Some scientific studies have shown that fMRIs can be used for things like lie detection, because there are certain parts of the brain that are more active when an individual tells a lie compared to when an individual tells the truth. The lie comes from an area of the brain that is generally recognized as being involved in imagination. And telling the truth involves areas of the brain that are more associated with recall of memory. fMRIs are also very useful to determine the severity of strokes, brain trauma, and various sorts of diseases in the brain. We can also use fMRIs to begin to study and understand the function of different parts of the brain. Recent studies have shown fMRIs can also be useful in diagnosing PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, in veterans from the military. The fMRI only involves individuals sitting in an MRI chamber. However, this is a little different than a slightly altered version of neuroimaging called the PET scan, or PET. PET stands for positron emission tomography. In this case, the patient is required to take a radioactive tracer molecule prior to sitting in the machine. This is what makes it substantially different than the MRI. That radioactive tracer is usually similar to glucose in a typical patient. In this case, the PET scan finds regions of the brain where glucose is being used. Again, with the assumption that where sugar is being used in the brain, that's where brain activity takes place. This again is measuring regions of the brain where there's blood flow. Combined with X-ray images, PET scans can reconstruct detailed 3D images with much finer detail than fMRI images. PET scans are used for many things, including understanding psychological disorders in brain activity, especially at the molecular level, understanding the function of different parts of the brain, much like fMRIs, determining how a certain drug enters and is used in the brain. This is particularly relevant for psychoactive drugs that are used for people that have mental illness, to see if certain drugs can pass through the blood-brain barrier, enter regions of the brain, and act on the necessary regions in order to treat the disorder. Finally, scientists in research labs have mounted PET scanners on top of the heads of animals in order to understand conscious activity during behaviors and movement of these research animals. Molecular biologists have gotten in on the action too, and they've analyzed the brain at the molecular level, doing so by adding dye to individual cells in order to identify connections between them. This has generated these beautiful images that you see here, colloquially referred to as the brainbow. But as you can see, individual cells are labeled with different colors, so you can see how many of them there are and the very complex networking that exists between them. We can also understand the molecular level of brain activity by manipulating the genes of the brain. We can do this using breeding experiments. One of the more recent studies, they introduced human neurons and human genes to mice. They found that when they introduced human neurons to mouse brains, there was no difference in mouse activity. Then some other scientists decided to try out human glial cells instead. It turns out that when human glial cells were introduced to mouse brains, the mice were able to learn faster and had a better memory. This led support to the idea that glial cells are what are important in defining human intelligence, which is unexpected because, as I mentioned before, the neurons are the ones that send the signals, and the glial cells used to be considered simply as support networks. But perhaps these cells are more important than just supporting the neurons. Let's move from there to understanding a little bit more about the brain by talking about diseases of the brain. We'll start off by talking about Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is the disease that generally has an unknown cause. Most individuals with Parkinson's don't know how they acquired the disease. There are some cases, however, like Muhammad Ali, where repeated head trauma is thought to have played a role. In Parkinson's disease, dopamine-filled cells die in a region of the brain called the substantia nigra, and this is in the midbrain, or the middle of the brain. This disease begins with hands and head mildly shaking, having difficulty with movement resulting in slow movement and rigidity. Eventually, Parkinson's leads to dementia and eventually death. It is a fatal disease. There's not much that we know about how it's caused, and also not much that we know about how to cure or treat it. Another disease of the brain that's widely studied and also not as well understood is Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease, unlike Parkinson's, has a known cause. The cause of Huntington's disease is that it's a genetic disorder. It is a dominant mutation, so you only have to inherit a single copy of the mutation in order to acquire the disease. So if you have a parent with Huntington's disease, you have a 50% chance of having this disorder. This results from a defect in a single protein. However, scientists still do not understand what the function of this single protein is. They do know, however, that if this protein is mutated, it causes damage and cell death in the brain. The symptoms, however, only begin to show around middle age, at around 35, 40, or 45 years old. Many of these individuals have already had children of their own before they realize that they have this genetic disease. Symptoms are similar to Parkinson's in that they begin with jerky, shaking movements and a lack of coordination, eventually, much like Parkinson's, leading to dementia and eventually death. Multiple sclerosis is another disease that's widely studied and a little understood. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a neurodegenerative disease that affects the glial cells in the myelin sheath around the nerve cell axons. This forms when the body's immune system attacks the myelin sheath. It's therefore an autoimmune disease, where the immune system of the body is attacking the body itself. By attacking the myelin sheath, this results in a weakening of the neural signal, and the strength of the neural signal is reduced, along with the speed of the neural signal. Symptoms can be varied and nonspecific, making diagnosis difficult. You can think of this as like allergies, where sometimes the allergies can be worse and sometimes a little bit better. People who suffer from multiple sclerosis can have severe symptoms some weeks, and then those symptoms can subside later. The symptoms include muscle weakness, muscle spasms, a decrease in sensation including poor vision and poor sense of touch, problems with speech or swallowing, fatigue, pain, depression, and difficulty thinking. Again, the cause of multiple sclerosis is unknown, but may involve a combination of genetics and the environment, specifically, possibly, an infection. There is no treatment for MS, though medicine that reduces the severity and strength of the immune system can lessen the symptoms. Our last mental disorder that we're going to talk about is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder associated with hallucinations and delusions, leading to problems with speech and thinking, depression and anxiety, and problems with social function. The onset occurs in young adults, and the causes are varied and complex, but may include a combination of genetics, changes in fetal development, such as if the mother became sick with the flu or some other disease while she was pregnant with the individual, and the environment. People with schizophrenia appear to have smaller frontal lobes and a smaller hippocampus with enlarged brain ventricles. This is so predictable in individuals with schizophrenia that you can use brain imaging as part of the diagnostic steps for this disease. The treatment for schizophrenia is medication, mostly used to suppress dopamine receptors. We'll talk about dopamine more later. Finally, I want to finish off by talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. I'll spend the next 2 minutes in our next section talking about this.